Adolf Dassler was a German cobbler, inventor and entrepreneur who established one of the biggest sports companies in the world, Adidas. Before founding Adidas, he co-founded a sports shoe manufacturing company with his eldest brother, Rudolf Dassler. The two worked together for more than 2 decades, after which disagreements between the brothers led to their separations and the establishing of their own companies. An innovative shoe designer with a keen interest in sports, Adi Dassler realized early that, for better performance, each sport requires specifically designed shoes for athletes. His interactions with sports people not only gave him feedback to improve his products, but also made him an early promoter of endorsements from athletes from some of the greatest of his time. But how exactly did this poor German man go from being a baker to building one of the greatest sports companies in the world? This is the story of Adolf Adi Dassler and his rise to the creation of the elite sporting company in the 21st century, Adidas. Adolf Dassler was born on the 3rd of November 1900 in Herzogenaurach, Germany, as the youngest child of Christoph and Pauline Dassler. He had 2 brothers, Fritz and Rudolf, and a sister, Marie. Though Christoph belonged to the family of weavers and dyers, he left the profession after the decline of the textile industry and turned to cobbling. After finishing his high school in 1913, Adolf began working as an apprentice at a bakery. However, he had absolutely no interest in the job. Instead, with his friend Fritz Zierlein, he took interest in sports and spent much of his spare time participating and competing in sports like track and field, soccer, ice hockey, javelin, and skiing. During this time, he also learned shoemaking from his father. He began to realize that each sport may require a specifically designed shoe for better results, and thus began his lifelong fascination with sports and shoes and his desire to produce the best footwear for top athletic performance. Between June 1918 and October 1919, Adolf Dassler served in the army. Upon return, he turned his mother's laundry room, now closed, into a small shoe workshop. Adi supported himself whilst attempting to start up his own business by repairing shoes in town. Facing the realities of post-war Germany, where there was no reliable supply for materials for production or credit to obtain factory equipment or supplies, he began by scavenging army debris in the war-torn countryside. Army helmets and bread pouches supplied leather for soles. Parachutes could supply silk for slippers. Dassler became quite adept at modifying available devices to help mechanize production in the absence of electricity. Using belts, for example, he rigged a leather milling machine to a mounted stationary bicycle powered by the firm's first employee. The business would be driven by Adi's vision of specialized sports designs. He produced one of the earliest spike shoes with spikes forged by the smithy of the family of his friends Fritz Zierlein. He constantly experimented with various materials to create strong but lightweight shoes. Years later, his widow, Kathy Dassler, said, "Developing shoes was his hobby, not his job. He did it very scientifically." After the war, Rudolf had determined on becoming a policeman, but after he completed his training, he joined Adi's firm on the 1st of July 1923. With the support of the Zierlein smithy producing spikes, Adi was able to register his company, Dassler's Brother Shoes Sports Factory, on the 1st of July 1924. By 1925, the Dasslers were making leather football boots with nail studs and track shoes with hand-forged spikes. 2 factors paved the way for the transformation of the business from a small regional factory, which they moved to in 1927 from their parents' home, to the international shoe distributor it would become. The first was the interest shown by former Olympian and then coach of the German Olympic track and field team, Joseph Weitzer. On learning of the plant and Adi's experiments, Weitzer needed to see the creation of these shoes for himself. Impressed by what he saw, a long friendship developed between the two, based on their shared desire in improving athletic performance with improved footwear, and Weitzer became a consultant to the company. The relationship would prove extremely valuable in giving Adi access to the athletes at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. As early as the 1928 Amsterdam Games, the Dassler's footwear was being used in international competitions. Lina Radke, the German middle distance runner who won gold in 1928, wore Dassler's track shoes, bringing international recognition for Adi's shoes. The second key factor for the shoe firm in the early 1930s was the role sports played in the racial nationalist philosophy of Adolf Hitler. With the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, athletic teamwork was prioritized. The Dassler brothers did not fail to see their economic interests would benefit from politics. All 3 Dassler brothers joined the Nazi Party on the 1st of May 1933, 3 months after Hitler was appointed Chancellor. Rudolf was said to be the most prominent believer of the 3. but it was Adi who decided that becoming a coach of and supplier to clubs in the Hitler Youth movement was essential to expanded production, and he joined in 1935. In the early 1930s, Adi Dassler enrolled in the Footwear Technical College in Pirmasens. One of the instructors was Franz Marz, a master producer of lasts. Dassler became a frequent house guest of Marz, who permitted Dassler to date his 15-year-old daughter, Kathy Marz. On the 17th of March 1934, the two wed as husband and wife. Kathy would go on to have frequent run-ins with Adi's parents, as well as Rudolf Dassler and his wife, all of whom lived in the same house. Years later, in a letter to Puma's American distributors, Rudolf explained that the rift with his brother was solely to be blamed on Kathy, who he claimed tried to interfere in business matters. He claimed that the brothers' relationship was ideal until 1933. Kathy would give birth to their son Horst in March 1936, their first daughter Inga in June 1938, and their second daughter Corinne in 1941. After the war, Bridget was born in May 1946 and Sigrid in 1953. Dassler saw the 1936 Berlin Olympic as the key springboard for international exposure. Although his relation with Weitzer ensured that most German athletes would wear Dassler footwear, Dassler had another athlete principally in mind: Jesse Owens, the American track and field star. Dassler found his way to meeting Owens and offered his shoes to the American star. Owens accepted the gesture and wore the distinctive shoes which he wore when defeating Lutz Long in the long jump in his two individual gold-winning performances in track and as a member of the America's gold medal upset of the German relay team. Dassler's association with Owens proved crucial to the success of the firm. Not only did it immediately catapult the company into an international player in the sportswear field, spiking sales overall, but it quite literally saved the firm. When American troops discovered that the Dassler factory was where the shoes for Owens' Olympic victories were made, they decided to let the work remain standing, and indeed many of the troops became good customers. Large orders for basketball, baseball, and hockey footwear gave the Dasslers the firm boost on the road to becoming a worldwide success story. Once war began, the Dasslers' ability to profit from Nazi enthusiasm for sports ended as the Reich became a war machine. The Dassler firm was permitted to operate, but its production was severely reduced. On the 7th of August 1940, Adi received notice of his conscription into the army. Although he reported in December to begin training as a radio technician, he was relieved of his duties on the 28th of February 1941 on the ground that his services were essential in the Gebäude Dassler. Rudolf, who had already served 4 years during the Great War, was drafted in January 1943. Wartime conditions exacerbated the simmering disputes between Rudolf and Adi's families. The houses that Christoph, Pauline, their sons, Rudolf and Adi and their wives, and 5 grandchildren all lived in together seemed stifling, and forced family associations at work had further complications by the sister Mary's employment there. Rudolf, angry that his younger brother was determined to be the leader of the Dassler firm, began to assert himself among family members. He used this assumed authority to deny employment to 2 of Marie's sons, asserting that there were enough family problems at the company. The decision devastated his sister, since those not employed in permitted industries were nearly guaranteed to be drafted into the army. Marie's sons were eventually conscripted, and they never returned from the war. Rudolf's rage boiled over when he was called upon again in January 1943 as part of the Total Mobilization Program. He later expressed to the Puma American distributors the belief that he was unfairly repaid for getting his brother released for the factory in 1942, and claimed that for his own immediate conscription he had to thank my brother and his Nazi party friends. Stationed in Tuskin in April 1943, Rudolf wrote to his brother, "I will not hesitate to seek the closure of the factory so that you be forced to take up an occupation that will allow you to play the leader and as a first-class sportsman be able to carry a gun." 6 months later, the factory was indeed shut down as part of the Reich's Total War Shortest War campaign, part of which involved converting all industry to military production. On leave at the time of the shutdown, Rudolf intended to take some of the leather inventory for his own use. Stunned to find that Adi had already done so, he denounced his brother to the county-level party leaders, according to Kathy Dassler. In December 1943, the shoemaking machinery of the Dassler firm was replaced by spot-wielding machines. The army determined that the Dassler plans would make a shoulder-fired tube copied after capturing American bazookas. Like the American prototype, the weapon was designed to be relatively lightweight and able to penetrate tank armor. The army's contractor was Schricker & Co., which shifted assembly to Herzogenaurach to avoid Allied air raids. The simple design of the weapon allowed the contractors to quickly train former seamstresses to spot wheeled sights and blast shields onto the pipes provided. By March 1945, 92,000 shoulder-fired tubes were in active use on the fronts of the rapidly constricting periphery of the German territory. Although the weapons was remarkably effective and easily produced, its availability came too late in the war to save the Reich. Back in Tuscan, Rudolf continued to make good on his resolve to wrestle the plans from his brother. Using contacts at the Luftwaffe, he attempted to have the production of shoulder-fired tubes replaced by government-ordered production of army boots under a patent he personally held. The patent proved defective and his plan came to nothing. Unable to obtain permission to leave the Polish outpost, Rudolf turned to his own devices. Several weeks before the 19th of January 1945, when the Soviets overran Tuscan and decimated his unit, Rudolf had fled to Herzogenaurach. The now defunct unit had been folded to the SS. The sources for what Rudolf did between his desertion from Tuscan and the funeral of Rudolf and Adi's father on the 4th of April 1945 is among the disputed records in the Americans' denazification panels. On the day after the funeral, he was arrested and taken to the Barenschanze prison run by the Gestapo in Nuremberg. He remained there until the Allied liberation in early May. When American troops reached Herzogenaurach, tanks paused before the Dassler factory, pondering whether to blow it up. Cathy Dassler immediately approached the troops and argued that the plant was simply a sports shoe producer. The troops spared the plant, taking over the family house in the process. 2 weeks after the liberation of Herzogenaurach, Rudolf returned. As the American denazification process proceeded, the threat of liability from their Nazi past drove an irreconcilable rift between brothers Rudolf and Adi, each seeking to save himself. On the 25th of July 1945, about 2 months after the arrival of US troops, Rudolf was arrested by the American occupation authorities on suspicion that he worked for the SS and engaged in counter-espionage and censorship, and was sent to an internment camp in Hammelburg. Rudolf began to prepare a defense that he did not voluntarily help the Reich and did not in any event engage in SS activities. The American investigators soon discovered his early Nazi Party membership and proof that he volunteered in 1941. They even knew that in Tuscan his job was to keep track of personal and smuggling cases. His key problem, however, was in explaining his activities after he had been summoned to Nuremberg in March by the Gestapo. Rudolf maintained that he had been summoned on the 13th of March for an investigation for his earlier unauthorized departure from Tuscan, and that he did nothing but report daily to the Gestapo. He claimed that he escaped on the 20th of March. Rudolf used written statements on his former superior in Tuscan and a driver he encountered after he was arrested by the Gestapo in April. Rudolf made use of the latter's testimony and claimed that he had been sentenced by the Gestapo to the Dachau concentration camp. Rudolf claimed that en route the driver was ordered to shoot all the prisoners, disregarded the orders, and continued towards Dachau, but was stopped by advancing Allied troops to whom he released the prisoners, including Rudolf. The American investigators in charge of the case did not accredit any of this testimony, which they regarded as a cover. He noted that both Rudolf's wife and his brother Adi testified that Rudolf worked for the Gestapo. The investigation ground on for nearly a year. During the time, it became apparent that it was not possible to hold all the prisoners for a detailed examination of the case, and the authorities decided to release all persons not deemed to be a security threat. Accordingly, Rudolf was released on the 31st of July, 1946. Before Rudolf was released, Adi himself had to appear before the denazification panel. The result was announced on the 13th of July 1946. Adi was declared a Belestatter, the second most serious category of Nazi offenders, which included profiteers and subjected the convict up to 10 years in prison. But the immediate threat was that he would be removed from management of his firm. His early membership in the Nazi Party and the Hitler Youth were not contestable. However, an appeal he amassed a portfolio of testimony attesting to his good conduct during the war. His early membership into the Nazi Party and the Hitler Youth were not contestable. However, on appeal, he amassed a portfolio of testimony attesting to his good character during the war. Adi's staunchest supporters were the mayor of his town, who the Allied forces trusted. A nearby mayor who was half Jewish testified that Adi warned him of a potential Gestapo arrest and hid him on his own property. A longtime Communist Party member testified that Adi was never involved in political activities, and Adi showed them far from profiting from the forced weapon production, the firm actually lost 100,000 marks. Despite Adi's evidence, the committee did not acquit him. Instead, they reclassified him as minder belästigter, lesser offencer, a category of lesser culpability, resulting in probation of 2 to 3 years with varied conditions, but still requiring that Adi not operate Dassler shoes. Adi hired counsel to appeal the decision. Rudolf, who had just been released, saw this as an opportunity to wrestle control of the business from Adi. In the course of the appeals proceedings, Rudolf Dassler inserted statements that claimed that Adi Dassler had organized the productions of weapons himself and for his own profit, and that Rudolf would have resisted the change in production if he alone was present. He further claimed that his brother had falsely denounced him and that Adi had made political speeches to employees at the plant. Among other proofs submitted by Adi's counsel was a strong denial of all of Rudolf's claims by Kathy. On the 11th of November 1946, Adi's status was changed to Mitlaufer, follower, relieving him of most of his civil disabilities. On the 3rd of February 1947, ownership was returned to him, and he was finally able to take control of his company once again. Rudolf's belief that Adi had denounced him and his conduct during his brother's appeal made further relationships between them impossible. In fact, it irreparably divided the family. Their mother Paulina sided with Rudolf and Friedel, who cared for her for the rest of her life. Their sisters Marie, who never forgave Rudolf for the death of her sons, sided with Adi and Kathy. Rudolf, his wife, and 2 children left the family home and moved across the river, where he would take over the second factory of the Dassler firm. In their separation, Adi retained the first factory and the family villa, after which the 2 brothers never spoke again. Dassler's firm found itself with the same problems that it faced at the very beginning. A world war had decimated the German economy and supplies for the shoe factory were hard to come by. In addition, the firm had to convert back from weapons to shoe production. This time, however, the American occupying authorities were interested in reviving economic activity in Germany. American officers had commandeered the Dassler house for their residence on the 16th of April 1945, and thus Adi had close contact with officials who gave him access to unneeded war material for production. Until a source of leather became available, Adi made use of the rubber from fuel tanks and rafts and canvases from tents to make shoes, allowing him to return to the business. During the negotiations to separate the firm, Rudolf and Adi allowed the employees to determine which firms they would work for. As Rudolf had mainly concerned himself with sales and administration, most of the sales staff opted to join Rudolf. The rest, including almost all the technicians and those involved in product development and production, remained with Adi. Adi ended up with nearly 2/3 of the employees. To fill the void left by the departure of the administrative personnel, Kathy and her sister Marianne Martz joined the firm and acted in a variety of capacities. Meanwhile, Adi was concerned in designing a distinctive look for his shoes so that everyone knew which athletes used his footwear. He fell upon the idea of coloring the straps used for reinforcement on the sides of the shoe a different color than the shoes themselves. He experimented with different numbers of straps and ultimately decided on 3. The 3 stripes became a distinctive mark of the Adidas shoes. In March 1949, Dassler registered the 3-stripe logo as the company's trademark. As for the company's name, the plan was to use a contraction of Adi's nickname and last name, but Adidas was rejected on the ground that it was used as a children's shoe manufacturer. Accordingly, in his 18th of August 1949 company registration, Adi added a handwritten I between Ad and Das to maintain the contraction of Adi Dassler. As a result, the company became known as Adolf Dassler Adidas Shoe Fabrik. Like the Dasslers, Sepp Herberger joined the Nazi Party in 1933. In 1936, after Germany's humiliating quarter-final defeat by Norway at the Berlin Games, the Nazi sports authorities appointed him to coach the national football team. Herberger began an association with the Dassler firm. After the breakup, Herberger decided with the Puma firm until Rudolf once again felt his authority challenged and insulted him. Herberger switched his allegiance to Adidas. In many respects, the fit was better with Adi, who was quiet, willing to learn the needs of football players, and more innovative than his brother. Herberger's drive to make Germany a dominant force in international football predated the war. Adi soon became a regular part of the entourage of the national team, who sat behind Herberger and adjusted players' shoes mid-game. West Germany, established in May 1949, was not eligible for the 1950 World Cup, the first after the war. and so all preparations were made with a view towards the 1954 matches in Bern, Switzerland. By that time, Adidas's football boots were considerably lighter than the ones made before the war, based on English designs. At the World Cup, Adi had a secret weapon, which he revealed when West Germany made the finals against the overwhelmingly favoured Hungarian team, which was undefeated since May 1950 and had defeated West Germany 8-3 in group play. Despite this defeat, West Germany made the knockout rounds by twice defeating Turkey. The team defeated Yugoslavia and Austria to reach the final, where the hopes of many German fans were simply that the team avoid another humiliating defeat at the hands of the Hungarians. The day of the final began with light rain, which brightened the prospects of the West German team, who called it Fritz Walter Wetter because the team's best players excelled in muddy conditions. Dassler informed Herberger before the match of his latest innovations, screw-in studs. Unlike the traditional boot, which had fixed leather spiked studs, Dassler's shoes allowed spikes of various lengths to be fixed depending on the state of the pitch. As the playing field at Wankdorf Stadium drastically deteriorated, Herberger famously announced, "Adi, screw them on." The longer spikes improved the footing of West German players compared to the Hungarians, whose mud-caked boots were also much heavier. The West Germans staged a comeback, winning 3-2 in what became known as the Miracle in Bern. Herberger publicly praised Dassler as a key contributor to the win, and Adidas's fame rose both in West Germany, where the win was considered a key post-war event in restoring German self-belief home and abroad, where in the first televised World Cup final viewers were introduced to their ultimate breakthrough. Thus began the extraordinary dominance of Adidas in the world of sports. Adi would go on to create another factory in 1959, which would be managed by his son Horst. He would further continue his expansion into apparels in 1967 before becoming the official football of the World Cup in 1970. Sadly, Adi would come to pass away due to a heart failure on the 6th of December 1978 at the age of 77. However, his legacy was continued through his son and wife, with Adidas continuing to be one of the most dominant names in the world of sports. There you have it, the story of how a fractured family with ties to the Nazi Party produced a man who went from being a baker to the creator of one of the most illustrious names in sports, synonymous with high quality and style, Adidas.